The evening sky burned with streaks of crimson as the frontiersman made his way back through the dense pines, his rifle slung across his shoulder and the weight of a fresh kill dragging behind him on a crude sled. The wilderness had long been his home, a place where silence spoke louder than any man's voice, where survival depended on sharp instincts and a steady hand. He thought the night would pass as usual, firewood stacked, meat salted, and his cabin keeping him safe from the chill that crept down from the mountains. But as he reached the clearing where his cabin stood, something was wrong. His boots pressed into damp soil, and his sharp eyes noticed a broken branch along the tree line. Then, closer to the cabin, his gaze fell on something that made his heart thud once against his ribs. Blood. It was not the faint streak of an animal carcass, nor the careless trail of a wounded deer. This was darker, heavier, a trail of human blood spattered across the leaves and soaking into the earth. His first instinct was caution. He crouched low, setting his rifle in his hands, and followed the crimson path. Each drop seemed to lead him closer to his cabin, closer to danger. The silence around him was unnatural. No night birds called. Even the wind had stilled. His pulse quickened as he imagined who or what had come this far into his refuge. He had built this cabin for solitude, far away from the chaos of men. Yet now, human blood marred the very threshold of his home. The trail smeared across the ground and onto the wooden step. He reached out and touched it with his fingers. It was still warm. Whoever had bled here had arrived only moments before him. He scanned the tree line, rifle raised, expecting ambush. Nothing moved. No eyes glinted from the shadows. Slowly he mounted the steps. The door to the cabin was not latched, swinging slightly in the breeze. His chest tightened. He always barred that door. Always. He had left it secure when he went hunting that morning. Someone was inside. The hunter pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. The smell of blood was stronger now, mingled with the faint smoke of his hearth fire. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and then he froze. In the far corner of the cabin, crouched against the wall, was a woman. Her dress was torn, her face pale as ash. One arm was wrapped around her middle, where blood seeped through the fabric, dark and wet. But it was not just her. Two small children huddled beside her, clutching her skirts, their wide eyes glistening in the fireht. The man's breath caught. Strangers. Wounded strangers. In his home, the woman raised her head slowly, her lips trembling as she spoke. Her voice was little more than a rasp, but it carried desperation strong enough to pierce through him. "Please," she whispered, her eyes locking with his. "Don't let them take my children." For a moment, the frontiersman said nothing. He stood in his doorway, the wilderness behind him and this fragile, bleeding family before him. His mind raced with questions. Who were they? Who had hurt them? Who was coming? But one thing was clear. The blood trail had led not just to his cabin, it had led to the edge of a story he had not chosen, but one he could no longer escape. The woman's plea hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. "Don't let them take my children." The frontiersman Ethan kept his rifle leveled, though his hands tightened around the stock as he studied the scene before him. The woman's back was pressed against the log wall of his cabin, her breathing shallow, her skin pale from blood loss. The children clung to her, their small bodies trembling in silence. They weren't loud, not crying or wailing, as most frightened children might. Instead, they pressed their faces against their mother's torn dress, as if they had already learned the danger of making noise. That silence unsettled Ethan even more than the blood. He lowered the barrel slightly, but he did not let go of caution. "Who are you?" His voice was low, steady, more a demand than a question. The woman swallowed hard. "Please, there's no time." "They're coming." Her eyes darted to the door behind him, wild and fearful. "If they find us, they'll—" She broke off, clutching her side as a spasm of pain racked her body. Ethan shut the door and slid the heavy wooden bar into place. The sound of it thudding into the iron latch seemed to reassure the children, if only a little. He crossed the room slowly, his boots thumping against the wood, and set his rifle on the table within reach. He crouched down to her level, his sharp eyes sweeping over the wound. The blood had soaked through the cloth at her waist, sticky and dark. He could tell it was deep, but not yet fatal if tended quickly. "You'll bleed out if I don't stop it," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The woman shook her head, her voice urgent despite the weakness in it. "Forget me. It's them. The children, they'll take them. They won't stop until they have them." Ethan studied her face. She wasn't lying, he could see it in her eyes, wide and burning with a desperate mother's fear. But he still didn't understand. "Who's after you?" For a moment she hesitated, as if naming them might summon them faster. Then she whispered, "Bounty men. Worse than wolves. They don't care if I live, only the children. They'll sell them like animals." The words twisted something deep inside him. Ethan had seen cruelty before, men who'd kill for a sack of coin, men who preyed on the weak. But to hear her speak of children hunted, stolen to be sold, it chilled him to the bone. One of the little ones, a girl with tangled dark hair, peeked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Mister," she said in a tiny voice, "please don't make us go back." Her lip quivered, but she held his gaze. Too brave for someone so small. Ethan felt the weight of their fear settle heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't asked for this. His cabin was built for solitude, for shutting out the world and all its troubles. Yet here the world was, bleeding across his floor, clinging to him with desperate hands. He exhaled sharply, rising to his feet. "Stay with them," he told the woman, though she could hardly move. He strode to the corner, pulled a cloth from a drawer, and returned with his hunting knife. He sliced strips from the cloth, knelt again, and pressed them firmly against her wound. She gasped, biting her lip to keep from crying out. "This'll hurt," he warned, tightening the makeshift bandage. "But it'll keep you alive until I can do better." Her trembling hand reached for his arm, clutching it weakly. You'll protect them?" she whispered. Ethan met her gaze. For years he had lived only for himself, bound to no one, needing no one. But now, staring at this woman and her two fragile children, he felt a part of himself stir, a part he thought long buried. He gave a single, firm nod. "They won't take your children," he said. His voice was calm, steady, but underneath it burned the quiet fire of a vow. And as he rose, glancing toward the barred door, Ethan knew the wilderness outside was no longer empty. Danger was coming, and it was bringing hell with it. The cabin was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that gave comfort. It was the heavy stillness before a storm, when every nerve in a man's body knew that something dangerous was moving closer. Ethan stood near the hearth, his rifle leaning against the table within reach, his eyes shifting between the wounded woman, her children, and the door. He had questions burning inside him, questions he needed answered before night fell. He turned to the woman, who had managed to sit upright against the wall despite the pain. Her face was pale, sweat glistening on her brow, but her eyes, those eyes still carried fierce determination. "You need to tell me everything," Ethan said firmly. "If I'm to keep you alive, I have to know what I'm up against." The woman pressed her lips together, as if weighing whether she could trust him. Finally, she nodded. "They started tracking me weeks ago," she began, her voice ragged. "I thought I could outrun them, but they never stop. Men like that don't. They're not lawmen, not soldiers. They're hunters, only their game is people." Ethan frowned. "Why the children?" Her hand went protectively to her son, the smaller of the two, who had curled against her side. "Because they're young," easy to mold, worth more than gold in certain markets. Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. To men like that, children are property to be bought and sold. They don't see faces. They only see profit. The girl's eyes glistened with tears she refused to shed. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd seen blood spilled over land, cattle, pride, but children stolen and traded like coin? That was a cruelty even the wilderness couldn't hide from his conscience. How many? Ethan asked, his voice a low growl. 4, maybe 5, the woman replied, wincing as pain shot through her. The leader, his name's Carver. He doesn't forgive failure. If he lost my trail, he'll burn the land down to find it again. Ethan had heard of Carver. A man with no loyalty, no honor. A scavenger who thrived in lawless places, surrounding himself with killers too desperate to ask questions. If Carver was after these children, he wouldn't stop until he had them. The woman's voice softened, breaking through Ethan's thoughts. I never meant to bring this to your door. I was just trying to find shelter for one night. But when I saw the smoke from your chimney, I had no choice. If you send us out, they'll have us before morning. Ethan didn't answer right away. He paced the floor once, then twice, his boots creaking against the boards. He had chosen this life in the wilds to escape the noise of men, to avoid entanglements. But this wasn't just noise, this was blood on his doorstep, children at his fire. His solitude was gone the moment that blood trailed to his cabin. Finally, he stopped and looked at her. You were right to come here, he said flatly. You'll stay until you can stand again. His eyes narrowed as he added, and when Carver comes, he'll find he's hunting the wrong man. A faint relief flickered across her face, but the children still stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. They didn't yet know whether to believe in the promise of protection or fear that it was only temporary. Ethan reached for his rifle and checked the chamber. He could already hear it in his mind, the crunch of boots on pine needles, the jingle of spurs in the night, the cruel laughter of men who thought themselves untouchable. They would come, and when they did, they would expect an easy prize. But the wilderness had teeth, and so did the man who lived in it. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Ethan sat at the edge of the table, his rifle resting in his lap, but his thoughts churned far louder than the silence around him. The woman's words echoed in his head, Carver, bounty men. They'll take my children. He had lived most of his life by one simple code, stay apart. People meant trouble. Towns meant politics and greed. Families meant ties that could be cut with tragedy. He had buried enough ghosts in his past to know that the safest way to live was alone, with only the land and his rifle for company. And it had worked for a time. His cabin was a sanctuary built from logs and sweat, standing against the storms, against the world. But now there were 3 strangers bleeding and trembling inside those walls. And with them came all the danger he had sworn to keep away. The woman had drifted into a fitful doze, exhaustion dragging her under, though her hands still curled tightly around her children as if even sleep couldn't break her grip. The boy clutched his mother's side, his small chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. The girl, the older one, stared at Ethan with wide, unblinking eyes from across the room. She was watching him, measuring him. He didn't know whether she was waiting for him to betray them, or hoping he wouldn't. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, the rough stubble scratching his palm. What right did he have to interfere? Carver's men weren't after him. If he turned the woman and her children out, the blood would no longer stain his doorstep. The wilderness was cruel, always had been. Men died, families vanished, and the land went on. It wasn't his burden to carry. And yet, he remembered another night, years ago, when he'd come home to find blood. Only that time it had been too late. His brother's ranch burned to the ground, the family slaughtered in a raid. He had arrived just in time to bury the dead, not to save them. That was the night he had turned his back on people. That was the night he'd sworn never to need or protect anyone again. But this was different. This time, he had found the blood before the fire. He had found the children alive. The girl shifted, her voice so soft it almost startled him. "Mister," she whispered, "are you going to send us away?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes, wide and fierce despite the fear trembling inside them. He thought of what Carver's men would do if they got hold of her and her brother. His jaw clenched. "No," he said finally, his voice rough. "You'll stay here." The girl blinked at him, and for the first time, her face softened. She pulled her brother closer, as though she believed his words might hold. Ethan rose, pacing to the window. Outside, the last of the daylight bled from the sky, and the forest thickened with shadows. Somewhere out there, Carver and his men were closing the distance. The wilderness was wide, but the trail of blood was sure. They would come, and soon. He checked the lock on the door, then ran his hand over the grain of the rifle stock. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. Still, doubt gnawed at him. He had built his life to avoid this very kind of fight. To take up arms for strangers meant risking everything he had left. But the truth was simple. If he did nothing, if he turned them out, the children wouldn't live to see another dawn. His solitude was broken, and he could not patch it back together. Not this time. With a deep breath, Ethan made his decision. He would fight. Not because he wanted to, not because he sought redemption, but because those children deserved a chance to live. Free. And though the thought of bloodshed weighed heavy, a fire stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. The night air outside pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing, cold and watchful. Ethan moved through the single-room shelter with the steady rhythm of a man who had faced danger before, though never quite like this. Each movement was purposeful, deliberate, as if he could drive back his doubts with the sound of his boots and the scrape of metal against wood. The first task was the woman. She stirred when he approached, her face pale in the flickering light. "I told you," she whispered weakly. "Don't risk yourself for us." Ethan shook his head. "You'll bleed out if I don't get this bandage tighter." He knelt and peeled back the cloth he had tied earlier. Blood had soaked through, sticky and warm against his fingers. He tore another strip from his old hunting shirt and pressed it down, binding her waist firmly. She gasped and clenched her jaw against the pain, her hand gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles whitened. "It'll hold," he muttered, tying off the knot. "Not perfect, but enough until I can heat a needle." Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Instead, she looked to her children, who watched him with wide, frightened eyes. Ethan followed her gaze. The boy's lips trembled as he leaned against his sister, while the girl sat stiff and upright, as though trying to be braver than her years allowed. "They'll need something to keep them quiet," Ethan said. He pulled a wool blanket from his cot and draped it over the children, tucking it snugly around their shoulders. "Stay close to your mother. Don't move unless I tell you." The girl nodded, her small chin lifting with a soldier's solemnity. Ethan felt a flicker of respect stir inside him. Once they were settled, he turned to his tools of survival. The rifle came first. He checked the chamber, running his fingers over the worn stock, making sure the mechanism was smooth. A handful of cartridges clinked as he laid them out on the table within arm's reach. Then came the knife, its blade sharp enough to skin a deer. Now honed to slice through more than hide. Ethan moved to the window, pushing the shutter open a sliver. The forest outside was a black wall, dense and unyielding. Somewhere in that darkness, men were riding. He couldn't hear them yet, but he knew they were out there, closing in with every passing breath. His mind ran over the defenses of the cabin. The walls were sturdy pine, the door thick enough to slow a bullet but not stop one. If Carver and his men wanted in, They'd come with fire, with lead, and with no regard for who was inside. Ethan dragged the heavy table across the floor, bracing it against the door. The wood groaned in protest, but it settled firm. He stacked spare firewood against the lower logs of the wall, a barrier against stray bullets. When he was done, he stood in the center of the room, listening. The fire cracked softly. The woman's breathing came shallow and pained. The children whispered to each other beneath the blanket. And outside, the wilderness stretched wide and merciless. He had faced wolves before. He had faced storms that split trees in half. But this fight would be different. This was man against man, and Ethan knew what men like Carver were capable of. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. He didn't know how many would come or how long he could hold them off. But he knew one thing. He would not let the cabin fall without a fight. At last, he crossed back to the woman. Her eyes followed him, weary but searching. "You mean to fight them?" she said, not as a question but as a certainty. Ethan nodded. They picked the wrong cabin to bleed on, and with that, he sat at the table, rifle across his knees, and waited for the darkness outside to deliver its storm. The cabin had grown so quiet it seemed even the fire hesitated to crackle. Ethan sat in his chair, rifle across his knees, his gaze fixed on the door. Every sense sharpened, straining to catch the faintest sound beyond the wooden walls. The night pressed close, thick with menace. The woman dozed fitfully against the wall. Her head slumped to one side, though her hand never released the children. The boy had curled up beneath the blanket, finally asleep, but the girl stayed awake, her wide eyes glinting in the firelight. Every so often she looked at Ethan, as though drawing courage from the way he sat so steady, so unshaken. Then he heard it, a faint rhythm carried on the still air. The distant crunch of hooves on pine needles, deliberate and slow. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. He leaned forward, tilting his head toward the shuttered window. The sound came again, closer now, the heavy step of horses making their way through the woods. "They're here," he muttered. Under his breath, the girl's hand crept from beneath the blanket, clutching her mother's sleeve. The woman stirred, forcing her eyes open. "Carver," she whispered, her voice laced with dread. Ethan rose silently and crossed to the window. He eased the shutter open just a crack. At first, he saw only darkness, the trees standing tall like sentinels. Then movement. A flicker of lantern light between the trunks. Shadows shifted, long and distorted, as several riders guided their mounts closer to the clearing. Their voices carried faintly through the stillness. Rough laughter and curses. "Lost half the trail in the rocks," one said. "Doesn't matter," another answered. "The woman's bleeding." "Can't be far." Ethan closed the shutter and stepped back, his jaw tightening. They were coming straight toward his cabin. He moved quickly but quietly. From a shelf above the hearth, he took a pouch of powder and shot, laying it within easy reach on the table. His knife he set beside it. Then he doused the fire until only a faint glow of embers remained, cloaking the room in shadow. The woman's breathing grew quicker. "You can't face them alone," she whispered hoarsely. "I've done worse," Ethan replied. Though in truth, he had never faced this particular kind of danger. Wolves in storms didn't think, didn't plot. Men like Carver were a different breed, cunning, cruel, and relentless. Outside, the riders drew closer. The steady clop of hooves became the scrape of boots on the ground as they dismounted. Voices rose clearer now. "Check the cabin," a man barked. "Smoke's cold, but someone's been here." Ethan crouched by the window again, peering through the narrow crack. He counted 4 figures moving toward the cabin, their shapes tall and menacing in the lantern glow. Rifles slung across shoulders, pistols gleaming at their sides. And then came a 5th, the one who walked ahead of the rest, broad-shouldered, with a long coat that swayed with each stride. His face was obscured by shadow, but Ethan knew instinctively, Carver. The men spread out, circling like wolves preparing for the kill. One kicked at the fire pit outside, scowling at the embers. Another rattled the shutters. Inside, the children whimpered, muffled quickly by their mother's trembling hand. Ethan raised his rifle, steadying it against the window frame. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadying into the familiar rhythm of a hunter poised to strike. He had only one chance to send a message before the night erupted into violence. Outside, Carver's voice cut through the silence. Low, cruel, certain. She's here. I can smell her fear. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. The shadows in the night had arrived, and soon blood would follow. The silence shattered with a single shot. Ethan's rifle thundered from the cabin window, and one of Carver's men dropped to the dirt, his lantern tumbling from his hand and hissing out in the damp grass. For a heartbeat, the clearing froze in stunned quiet. Then the night erupted. Gunfire exploded against the cabin walls. Bullets slammed into the thick pine logs, splintering wood and spraying shards across the floor. The children cried out, muffled quickly by their mother's arms as she drew them close against her bloodied side. Smoke curled in the air, acrid and choking, while outside men shouted curses. Light the place up. One of them bellowed, Burn him out. Ethan ducked back from the window, his rifle already reloading by instinct, hands moving with the steady rhythm of long practice. He didn't waste a shot. Each one had to count. The cabin wasn't a fortress, but it would hold long enough if he aimed true and kept the fear at bay. Another shadow darted across the clearing, torch in hand. Ethan leaned forward, took a breath, and fired. The torch-bearer spun and fell hard, flames licking the ground as the torch sputtered into the dirt. The man groaned, then went still. Damn it! Another cursed. Keep your heads low. A bullet tore through the shutter inches from Ethan's face, whistling past his ear. He dropped flat against the floorboards, then rolled to the opposite window. Through the narrow slit, he glimpsed Carver himself standing tall at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, watching the chaos with a cruel patience. He wasn't firing. Not yet. He was waiting, testing the defenses. The thought chilled Ethan, but he forced it aside. He couldn't afford to think of Carver's plan only the next second. The next shot. He rose, fired again, and another attacker went down. The recoil slammed against his shoulder, but he hardly felt it. Every shot echoed like thunder in the night, each one a message. This cabin is not yours to take. Still, the barrage outside did not cease. Lead pounded into the wood, shaking the cabin with each strike. A bullet cracked through a narrow gap and buried itself in the table, scattering cartridges across the floor. Ethan snatched them up quickly, hard hammering. His supply wasn't endless. If this turned into a drawn-out siege, he would run dry before Carver did. Behind him, the woman's ragged voice broke through the din. You can't hold them forever. Ethan glanced at her. Sweat beaded her brow, but her eyes burned with a fierce clarity. She wasn't begging this time. She was warning him. I don't need forever, he muttered, snapping another round into place. Just long enough. Another rush of footsteps outside. Someone tried the door, slamming a shoulder against it. The bar groaned, the table shuddered, but it held. Ethan strode forward, shoved his shoulder against the doorframe, and fired through a crack. A scream followed, then the thud of a body hitting the earth. The girl whimpered, clutching her mother tighter. Ethan met her gaze for only a second. Stay low, he ordered, his voice sharp but steady. The siege pressed on. Shadows moved in the tree line, circling, testing. Shots rang, some wild, some sharp and calculated. The night smelled of smoke, sweat, and gunpowder. Ethan reloaded again, his motions mechanical, practiced, though his mind kept racing ahead calculating how long before. Carver sent them all at once, because Ethan knew this wasn't the true fight. Not yet. Carver was waiting, holding back, letting the others waste their bullets and their fear. The real storm hadn't struck, and when it did, Ethan feared the cabin walls might not be enough to keep death out. The gunfire ebbed for a moment, replaced by the hiss of voices outside. Ethan pressed his back to the wall, rifle in hand, sweat rolling down his temple. The pause wasn't victory, it was worse. It meant Carver was changing tactics. Then he smelled it. Smoke, sharp and biting. His stomach dropped out through a crack in the shutter. He caught sight of a man crouched low near the cabin's wall, torch in hand. Another carried a bundle of dry brush, tossing it against the logs. Flames licked upward, orange tongues climbing hungrily toward the eaves. "They'll burn us out," Ethan muttered under his breath. The woman stirred, her face pale but her eyes alert. "They won't stop," she rasped. "That's how Carver works. If he can't break a door, he burns it down." Ethan gritted his teeth. He couldn't just sit inside and wait for the smoke to choke them. He had built the cabin with his own hands, but he'd burn with it if he didn't act. He crossed to the door, testing the bar that held it shut. His heart hammered in his chest. Every instinct told him to stay inside, to defend from the safety of the walls. But if he stayed, the fire would win. Behind him, the girl whispered, "Mister, don't go." Her voice trembled, and for the first time, her bravery cracked out. Ethan turned, meeting her eyes. They were wide and glistening, full of a fear she didn't want to show. He crouched down just long enough to place a steady hand on her shoulder. "I'll be back," he said firmly. "You keep your brother quiet. Protect your mama." Her lip quivered, but she nodded, clutching the blanket tighter around them. Ethan straightened and looked at the woman. She was watching him, pain etched in her face, but there was something else to understanding. She knew what he was about to do. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. "Be careful." He gave a single nod. With one swift motion, Ethan lifted the bar from the door and eased it open. Night air rushed in, cold and thick with smoke. He slipped out like a shadow, rifle raised, the door closing silently behind him. The clearing was chaos lit by firelight. One man crouched near the wall, torch pressed against the logs. Ethan raised his rifle and fired. The torchbearer dropped instantly, the flames spilling uselessly into the dirt. Another cursed and swung his pistol toward Ethan. But Ethan moved first. He charged from the shadows, the rifle stock cracking across the man's jaw with bone-snapping force. A third came at him with a knife, the blade glinting red in the fire's glow. Ethan spun, shoving his shoulder into the attacker's chest, and the two grappled fiercely. The knife slashed across Ethan's sleeve, tearing fabric, grazing skin. He snarled, drove his knee into the man's gut, and forced him to the ground. The knife clattered away. The gunfire resumed, flashes lighting the tree line. Ethan ducked behind the corner of the cabin, heart pounding. His chest burned from the near miss, but he was still standing. Still fighting. From the shadows beyond the clearing, Carver's voice rang out, mocking and cold. "Not bad, Hunter. But you can't hold forever. I'll gut you and drag those brats screaming into the dark before dawn." Ethan's jaw clenched. Carver's words weren't meant for him alone. They were meant to break the woman, the children, to make them believe there was no hope. But Ethan wasn't about to let fear rule the night. Not again. He checked his rifle, breath steadying. He had already chosen to fight, chosen to protect. If it meant bleeding, if it meant dying, so be it. Because some battles weren't about survival. They were about courage. And this was his. The fire had been stamped out, but smoke still curled around the cabin like a warning. Ethan crouched at the corner of the wall, the rough logs at his back, rifle warm in his hands. His muscles ached, his sleeve was sticky with blood. and the night air burned in his lungs, but he was still standing across the clearing. Carver's men gathered, fewer now but no less dangerous. Their eyes glinted in the firelight, their nerves fraying. Carver himself stood tall among them, his hat shadowing his scarred face, his pistol gleaming. "Last chance, Hunter." Carver's voice boomed through the night. "Hand over the woman and her brats and I'll let you live. Stand in my way and you'll die screaming." Ethan rose slowly, rifle raised, stepping out where they could see him. His silhouette cut against the smoke and the dying flames. His voice was steady, calm, and it carried further than Carver's threats. "You want them," Ethan said. "You'll walk over me to get them. And I promise you won't make it far." A ripple of unease passed through the gang. Carver snarled, spitting into the dirt. "Then die with them." He raised his hand and the clearing erupted. Gunfire tore through the night. Bullets slammed into the cabin's walls, splinters flying. Ethan moved fast, firing in sharp, measured bursts. One man fell. Another screamed and clutched his leg. Smoke from the rifles mixed with the haze of the smoldering fire. Clouding the battlefield dot inside the cabin, the children clung to their mother, who pressed them close despite her pain. She prayed silently, not for herself, but for the man outside who fought like a wall of stone to keep them safe. Ethan ducked, rolled, and came up behind a fallen log, reloading with quick, sure hands. His heart hammered, but his mind was clear. Every shot counted. Every move mattered. The outlaws pressed in, wild and desperate. One charged with a pistol raised. Ethan fired first dead center. The man crumpled. Another lunged from the side, knife glinting in the moonlight. Ethan dropped his rifle, caught the man's wrist, and drove his elbow into his face. Bone cracked. The knife fell. Ethan shoved him back, grabbing his rifle again in one smooth motion. Still they came, shadows in the smoke. But for each one who closed in, another dropped to Ethan's bullets or blows. His body screamed with exhaustion, but something deeper drove him forward, the memory of his own losses, the weight of every time he hadn't been able to save someone. Tonight, he would not fail. Finally, only Carver remained. The gang leader stepped forward, gun leveled, a cruel grin twisting his mouth. "You think you're some hero, Hunter? You're nothing but a fool bleeding out in the dirt." Ethan's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his rifle steady despite the ache in his arms. His eyes locked on Carver's, unflinching. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm the fool standing between you and them. And that's enough." Carver snarled and fired. Ethan dropped low, the bullet whistling past his head. He squeezed his trigger. His shot cracked through the night, clean and final. Carver staggered, eyes wide with shock, then collapsed into the dirt. Silence followed, broken only by the faint crackle of dying fire and the heavy thud of Ethan's breathing. The clearing was littered with still bodies. The gang was finished. The children were safe. Ethan lowered his rifle, the weight of the night finally pressing down on him. He turned toward the cabin, where two small faces peered out through the crack of the door. Wide-eyed but alive Dot, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir in his chest, something he thought he had buried forever. Hope. The night was still at last. Smoke from the smoldering brush hung in the clearing, a faint veil against the rising moon. Ethan stood motionless, rifle slack in his hands, as the silence pressed in. The ground was littered with the bodies of men who had once thought themselves untouchable. Carver lay among them, his pistol gleaming useless in the dirt. Ethan drew a long breath and turned toward the cabin. The door creaked open, and the children rushed out, their bare feet padding across the cold earth. The girl clutched her brother's hand as if she'd never let go, their wide eyes fixed on him. For a moment, they hovered in the doorway, uncertain if it was truly safe. "It's over," Ethan said softly, lowering his rifle. "You're safe now." The girl let out a choked sob and bolted across the clearing, her brother stumbling after her. They threw themselves against him, their small arms wrapping tight around his waist. Ethan froze, stunned by the suddenness of it. For years he had lived without a single human touch, without warmth beyond the fire he built for himself. Now, two trembling children clung to him as though he were the only wall left standing in their world. Slowly, awkwardly, he lowered a hand and rested it on their shoulders. His throat tightened. "You're safe," he repeated, his voice rough, but steadier now. The woman appeared next, leaning heavily against the doorway, her wounded side bandaged with rough cloth. She moved slowly, but her gaze was strong, fixed on Ethan as though he were the only solid thing left in her life. "You kept your word," she whispered when he met her eyes. "You didn't let them take my children," Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "They won't hurt you again." She stepped forward, swaying slightly. Ethan disentangled himself from the children just long enough to cross the space and steady her. His hand found her arm, firm and steady, and he felt the fragility of her body beneath his grip. She was alive, but barely. She had fought long before he'd ever known her name. "You'll need time to heal," he said, his voice gentler than he intended. "I can help." "The cabin? It's yours as long as you need it." Her eyes shimmered, not with weakness, but with gratitude. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk everything for strangers?" Ethan paused, searching for words. For years, he had run from people, from pain, from the past that had left him hollow. But tonight, staring at her, at the children, he felt something shift inside him. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," he said finally. "And I couldn't let it happen again, not if I could stop it." Her lips trembled, but she smiled faintly. It was small, fragile, but it was real. Together they walked back toward the cabin. The children followed, still clutching Ethan's sleeve as though afraid he might vanish. The fire in the hearth was low, but it cast a warm glow across the rough-hewn walls. For the first time in years, the cabin no longer felt like a fortress of solitude. It felt like something more. As Ethan laid his rifle aside, the boy's voice broke the silence. "Mister, will you stay with us?" Ethan looked at him, then at the girl, and finally at their mother. 3 pairs of eyes watched him, waiting. Something long buried stirred again in his chest, filling the hollow space where grief had once lived. He gave a slow, firm nod. "Yes, for as long as you need me." The woman sank into the chair by the fire, the children curling up beside her. Ethan added a log to the flames, the crackle filling the room. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man alone in the wilderness. He felt like he belonged, and as the night deepened outside, Ethan understood that what had begun as blood on the trail had ended in something far stronger than survival, something he thought he'd never find again. A new beginning.